Hello, my name is Phil Easter, historian and writer from Baltimore, Maryland, also known as
The
the
Amazing Memory Man.
Man. We are recording here tonight on Sunday, November 6, 2022. And last night, on Saturday, November 5th, was the final game of the World Series this year, the 2022 World Series, where the Houston Astros beat the Philadelphia Phillies 4-2. But tonight I'm here with my friend Louis Berman. Welcome, Louis, to my channel. And we are going to discuss the World Series games that we have seen in person over the years. Now, living here in Baltimore most of my life, back in the 1960s and 70s and early 80s, the Baltimore Orioles were an outstanding team. They made it to the World Series 6 times between 1966 and 1983. The 66 series was against the Los Angeles Dodgers, and it was very hard to get tickets then, and I know my family and a lot of people tried to get tickets and they were shut out. I have a good friend named Jack who was able to go to those two of those games that were played in Baltimore, Game 3 and Game 4, as the Orioles beat the Los Angeles Dodgers in 4 straight games, and that was remarkable. The Dodgers were heavily favored to win that series. They had the 2 best pitchers in baseball then, Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale, but the underdog Orioles swept them in 4 straight games. So I watched all those games on TV, but then the next time the Orioles made the series was in 1969, when they played the New York Mets. And I was able to go to Game 2 of that series on Sunday, October 12th, 1969. My mom and I went out. We did not have tickets beforehand, but we were able to get tickets that day. The Orioles won the first game the day before on October 11th. Unfortunately, my first World Series game, the Orioles lost 2-1 to the Mets. And then they went to New York, and the Mets won all 3 games in New York City. So the Mets won 4 straight, but the Orioles did at least win the first game. But still, the Mets won in 5 games. And they were considered a Cinderella team that year. But the very next year, in 1970, the Orioles won the American League pennant once again. And this time they would face the Cincinnati Reds, a fine team in the National League who had many great players, such as Pete Rose and Johnny Bench and other players. They were called the Big Red Machine at that time. But the Orioles also had the Robinsons, Brooks and Frank Robinson. Brooks Robinson, already considered the best defensive third baseman in baseball history. And Frank Robinson, who came to the Orioles in 1966 and won the Triple Crown that year, a great individual achievement, and helped to lead the Orioles to that first World Series victory in '66. So Frank and Brooks Robinson, also Boog Powell, and an outstanding pitchers like Jim Palmer and Dave McNally. In the first game of the '70 World Series in Cincinnati, pitcher Dave McNally did something that never happened before or since in baseball history. He hit a grand slam home run in the World Series game at pitcher. There haven't been too many grand slam home runs hit in the World Series by any type of player, but pitchers generally are not very good hitters when they come to bat. And here he hit a grand slam, helped the Orioles win that game. And the Orioles also won the second game in Cincinnati. The series switched to Baltimore. The Orioles won the third game, but they did lose the next day, the fourth game. Still up 3-1, I was able to get a ticket for Game 5 of that series. And my most wonderful baseball memory, to see the Orioles win the series that day. They won Game 5 by a score of 9-3, and the series 4-1. And Brooks Robinson, again, was fabulous on defense, but even as a hitter, in that 5-game series, he had a .429 batting average. His lifetime batting average was .267, so he really rose to the occasion in that World Series. And Louis, I believe you were at that game also.
I was at that game. We were in sitting in left field, and we got a really good view of Brooks making some incredible catches.
Yes, it was
My
amazing.
father took me to the game,
Oh, that's wonderful.
and it was great.
If you and your dad went to
And my
that
brother,
game. And
yeah.
your brother too. Oh, that's
Yeah.
wonderful. And now Lewis and I did not know each other then. I should point out we met 8 years ago in 2014. But it's just nice to know that we were both at that game. And as I mentioned, a friend named Jack also was at that game. I did not know him at that point either, but we all found out when we talk about these baseball memories that all three of us were at that game in 1970. To actually see the Orioles win in person was a wonderful thing, you know. As I say, in '66, I watched on TV, and it was so hard to get tickets for those games, but I was so happy in 1970. It was a Thursday, October 15th, 1970. I remember the exact day. It was 2 days before my 18th birthday, so it was a very happy early birthday present, and Baltimore rejoiced in a second World Championship. Well, the next year, 1971, for the third year in a row, excuse me, the Orioles won the American League pennant. And they faced the Pirates in the World Series, the Pittsburgh Pirates.
Pittsburgh Pirates, and that series went to 7 games. It was very exciting. And you were at games
I was at games 1 and 6.
1 and 6, and I was at games 6 and 7. So it turns out Phil and I, with not knowing each other, were at 2 World Series games together. And of course, I was originally from Pittsburgh. Don't hold that against me. And so my childhood hero was Roberto Clemente, who was the MVP of that series. And in the 7th game, of course, I saw him make an amazing throw from right field, nail a batter.
Yes.
Might have been Frank Robinson, I don't remember. But
Yeah,
your memories.
He had a home run that day, Roberto Clemente, and the Pirates beat the Orioles 2-1.
That's right.
It was on my birthday, the mixed field, October 17th, 1971, the final game. But, you know, it was an exciting series, and it went 7 games, and that's always, you know, both teams contested well. And it was amazing that the Orioles won 3 pennants in a row, American League pennants, and faced different teams in the World Series each of those years. Well, 4 years later, in 1975, I was living in Boston at that time. I lived there briefly, 1975 and part of 1976. And I was able to get a ticket to the opening game of the Great World Series between the Boston Red Sox and Cincinnati Reds. Fenway Park is probably the smallest park in baseball. It holds about 35,000 people. And I was able to get a ticket somehow. It was hard getting tickets for that, but I got a ticket to the opening game. I saw that in person. Now, it turned out most of the games of that series were very close, but that happened to be the day when the Red Sox shut out Cincinnati 6-0. All 6 runs were scored in the 7th inning, though. It was the bottom of the 7th. They had one big breakout inning, and Louis Tiant was the pitcher who had pitched for other teams before that, including the Cleveland Indians. But he had a World Series victory that day. The Reds came back to win the next day on Sunday, October 12th. And then the series moved to Cincinnati, and the Reds won 2 out of 3. So they came back to Boston. The Red Sox were trailing 3-2. But then it was several days before they could play Game 6. There were several days in a row where it rained really hard in Boston. So the series resumed on October 21st. Here it began on October 11th. So the series resumed on October 21st. And that was one of the most famous games in World Series history. I was at a bar that night watching with other people. And it's the first time ever, and keep in mind, the World Series began in 1903. The first time ever a World Series game technically was played on 2 different dates because the game went past midnight. So it was actually October 22nd, about the 12th inning, I believe. The game was tied 6-all, and Boston Red Sox catcher Carlton Fisk hit a very famous home run where it hit the foul pole, left field foul pole. But that's a home run. And so the Red Sox won a thriller by the score of 7-6 to even the series.
Was it that game where there was, I think, a controversial catcher's interference call?
I think that was actually maybe game 3 or 4 in
Uh-huh.
Cincinnati. It was one of the games in Cincinnati.
It
that
was
happened.
one of the most remarkable World Series ever played.
It really was. And it came down to that 7th game, and on the night of October 22nd, and I was at a bar watching this with many people in Boston. We were hoping the Red Sox could win, but final score, Cincinnati 4, Boston 3. And so they won the series 4-3 as well, a 7-game series. But it was so exciting, it really was. And that game the Red Sox won, the 6th game, was just incredible. And it's put down as one of the greatest World Series ever. And Pete Rose was named as most valuable player of that series. Well, 4 years later, when I'm back here in Baltimore in 1979, that was the year I had a wonderful trip to Great Britain and Ireland for 15 weeks. I traveled to many parts of Great Britain and Ireland from June 26th to October 10th, 1979. As the timing was, I got back on the night of October 10th when the very first game of the World Series was taking place between the Baltimore Orioles and again the Pittsburgh Pirates, like 8 years before in 1971. Again, the Orioles would play the Pirates, and the way it turned out, the Orioles would have the first 2 games. The next 3 were in Pittsburgh, and since it went 7 games, as it turned out, games 6 and 7 were back in Baltimore once again, similar to 1971. I went to the 2nd game the very next night with my friend Jack. We were able to get tickets to the 2nd game of the World Series. I was pretty excited. I just had a wonderful trip, and now I'm back for not just any baseball game, but the World Series, the highest level of competition. And so Jack and I sat in right field, and the Orioles had won the first day, but the Pirates did win the 2nd game. So it went to Pittsburgh, but a strange thing happened. The next 2 games, the Orioles won in Pittsburgh. They led 3-1. Now they did lose game 5 in Pittsburgh, but still coming back to Baltimore, up 3-2, you'd figure the Orioles would have a good chance of winning either game 6 or if not, at least game 7. But that's not what happened, is it, Lewis?
No, it's not what happened.
The Pirates came back, won game 6, and on October 17th, 1979, on exactly my 27th birthday, my friend Jack and I got tickets to that 7th game, and I believe it was Willie Stargell hit a big home run, and the Pirates won by a score of 4-1, and so the series 4-3, another 7-game World Series. Now, Lewis, you were living in Cincinnati at that time.
I was going to school in Cincinnati, and I actually had tickets to the World Series. Unfortunately, the World Series wasn't in Cincinnati because Cincinnati played Pittsburgh in the playoffs and lost the playoffs to the Pirates, and they had to sell the World Series tickets before the playoffs. So people in Pittsburgh and in Cincinnati both had tickets, and I had a ticket and got a refund.
You're right. You almost could have had another Orioles, Cincinnati Reds World Series.
That's right.
You could have, but as it turned out, it was Pittsburgh once again. But then 4 years later, in 1983, the Orioles won the American League pennant for the 6th time, and they would face the Philadelphia Phillies, a city not too far away. I think they sometimes called that the I-95 World Series, up and down. It was just 100 miles apart between the 2 cities, so the whole United States, it came down to 2 cities just 100 miles apart. And at that time, Pete Rose was now playing for the Phillies, wasn't he? He left Cincinnati for a while. He played for the Phillies from about 1979 to 83. And the next year, it happened in 84, he went to Montreal briefly, played for the Expos for about half the season, and then went back to Cincinnati to finish his career. But in 1983, I saw the first 2 games that were played here in Baltimore on October 11th and 12th. I went with a young friend of mine by the name of Dave Stewart, and he had just graduated from Johns Hopkins University, I think in 1981. He was an outstanding cross-country runner, the best in their cross-country team, and then he was now the coach of the cross-country team at Johns Hopkins. But he's from the Philadelphia area originally, so Dave and I went to the first 2 games, and the Phillies won that first game by a score of 2-1, but the Orioles came back to win the 2nd game, and then they went to Philadelphia, and the Orioles won the next 2 and were were up 3-1, and it came down to one more game in Philadelphia. And Lewis, tell us about that game. You went to
So
that
this
game.
was the third final game of a World Series that I've been to. My brother had been to the previous game in Philadelphia, and so we went up just hoping to get tickets. We got scalp tickets for, I think, face value or under face value, because all the fair weather Philly fans were bailing out. And we sat in the stratosphere in center field.
Oh.
And Eddie Murray hit, 2 home runs in that game. And the Orioles won. And the Philly fans, being Philly fans, pelleted us with all kinds of things, including metal objects and beer cans and everything else. We took off and came to Baltimore and beat the Orioles bus back to Memorial Stadium, and then we're at the celebration at Memorial Stadium, and then we went to the World Series parade a couple days later. So that was a thrill.
Yes, it was a great memory, and it's great that you saw that final game in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Interesting to see your team play in another city, It's,
right.
And so that was great.
I will point out that, interesting that you mentioned that the Pirates, both of those series were 7 games, because I was a little tiny kid in Pittsburgh in 1960 during one of the more famous World Series when it went to 7 games against the mighty, powerful Yankees. And the Yankees probably were favored overwhelmingly to win that series.
Players like Mickey Mantle, Roger Maris.
The Pirates took him to 7 games, and the decisive run was hit in the bottom of the 9th inning when Bill Mazeroski, the second baseman, hit a home run. So, of course, I was a huge Pirates fan at that time, and I didn't make it to the series, but did make it to the World Series parade sitting on my father's shoulders.
Isn't that great? You were 3 years old?
4.
Before at that time, yeah. Isn't that great? And to have that memory of your baseball memory of the 1960 Pirates. It was one of the greatest World Series in baseball history. It really was. The Yankees were heavily favored to win that. And I do know that some of the games the Yankees won were by very large scores, and the Pirates would often win closer games, 5-4, 5-3 or less. Well, so it was like the first 6 games, the 3 higher scoring games won by the Yankees, the closer games, the lower scoring, won by the Pirates. So coming to Game 7, it turns out to be what you might call the Yankee style game, high scoring, but the Pirates still win in that case.
In the bottom of the 9th.
10-9 was that final. 19 runs in that game. Incredible, but the Pirates upset the Yankees. I happen to know the Pittsburgh Pirates have been to the World Series just 7 times, but they won 5 of those 7. They have a good, percentage there of winning. They were in the very first World Series in 1903 against the Boston Red Sox, but the Boston did win that series in 1903. But they were the teams competing, Boston for the American League and Pittsburgh for the National League. Well, thank you, Lewis, tonight for coming over and sharing these World Series memories.
Love to.
It's been 39 years, however, since the Baltimore Orioles have made it to the series, and we hope we could see at least one more time in our lifetime for that to happen. But this year, the Orioles had a better season than in several years. They at least got back to the winning record. They won more games than they lost because they had some pretty lean years recently, losing more games than they've won. So we'll see how it goes forward in the future. But the World Series, a great American tradition, going back to 1903. This is Phil Easter, the Amazing Memory Man. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. Good night.